Welcome to another random video by your friend, Matthew. Today I'm going to talk about non-dualism. Non-dualism is a topic I've been interested in for several years, and I would say most, if not all, of the videos that I make about my thoughts on spirituality and philosophy have non-dualism as a background, in the background, or in the foreground. Just non-dualism pervades the way that I think about spirituality and philosophy. And, I first came upon the notion of non-duality through Buddhism. And there's an old Indian Buddhist philosopher named Nagarjuna or Nagarjuna. This Indian writer and philosopher, he existed in the 2nd century of the Common Era. I think he was born around like 150 CE/AD. And, I mention him because he proclaimed a pretty radical statement, which is that absolute reality and relative reality are not separate. They are non-dual. So let me just briefly kind of try to concisely describe what non-dualism usually means. The tradition of Advaita Vedanta is a very key non-dual tradition, and in fact, Advaita means non-dual. Basically, it means no second. There is no second. It's all one. In that tradition, everything is Brahman. There's nothing outside of Brahman. There's nothing outside of the absolute. So, this is pretty different from a lot of other mainstream traditions, right? I mean, most mainstream expressions of religion, not all, but most, have a pretty dualistic vision of God, for example, or of like divine reality or something. And most often in mainstream religion, this life right here, down here, the earthly life, the human being, is seen as separate from God or separate from divine reality. We can see this in Genesis of the Bible, right? Eating the fruit from the knowledge of good and evil, that separates the human being from God, kind of, right? And so a lot of common traditions have a dualistic vision of the human condition and of divine reality and God and the absolute. But that dualistic vision is not something I really resonate with. I resonate much more with non-dualism. There is no second. There is no separation between the absolute and the relative, right? So relative reality in Buddhism and even Vedantic traditions and stuff, relative reality is this this earthly plane, the life of a human being, the life of living things on earth, the life of forms that perish, the conceptual mind, socially constructed stuff is one way to look at it, right? If we just look at it on the human level, relative reality is the reality that we have constructed from our conceptual mind. We have these clocks, we have calendars, those kinds of things that are linked to something that we're observing in the natural world, but those are social constructions, just like language is a social construction that we came up with. We socially constructed it in order to navigate our lives, more easily, I guess, just like maps, actual maps, all of these maps of reality that we construct in order to navigate reality, all those maps and all that stuff, even our names, right? And our egos, our self-narratives, all that stuff is relative reality, it's relative because it's relative because it perishes, right? It's not timeless, and it has a temporary or fleeting existence, so it's relative in that way. But it's also relative because it doesn't touch on the totality of things. The conceptual mind and the analytical mind break reality down into parts. That's what analysis means. The word analysis means to break something down into parts to understand the whole. But the analytical mind, the conceptual mind, breaks things down into parts, which, there's beauty to that. It makes life manageable. It can feel, and it probably would be very chaotic if we didn't have ways to, if we didn't break reality down into parts to make it more manageable. So that's relative reality, but in absolute reality, in some ways you could say that absolute reality, it's absolute because it it's not finite. Being itself is beginningless and endless and timeless. Existence itself, these things are not relative in the sense that they don't depend on something else for an existence, right? Like everything in the relative world depends on something else for its existence. And in some views of the absolute does not depend on anything else for it to exist. It's self-sustaining, and somehow self-created. But the whole thing about non-dualism is that even though we can see the relative and the absolute, the big claim is that they're non-dual, actually. They seem dualistic. They seem like they're separate, but they're actually one. That's what I love. And, and that's what's so cool about many traditions, but Tantra comes to mind because Tantra takes the non-dualism of Advaita Vedanta, which says is everything is Brahman, but the world is an illusion. Tantra says, well, if everything is Brahman, then this relative world is also Brahman. It's also divine. It's also God. So, you see that in Nagarjuna in Buddhism. He was an early figure of Mahayana Buddhism. And, Zen... Zen is very non-dualistic in the sense that, in classic Mahayana ways it is, and it just puts this really strong emphasis on the present, the present reality, right here, right now. And anytime in Zen, in a Zen koan or something, you have a student who's trying to make sense of Buddha's teachings in the past, for example, or scriptures from the past, or any saintly figure from the past, or trying to make sense of what it says in a book, or trying to make sense of a person's life that's not them. And usually, the teacher in a koan will kind of in one way or another, either, arrest that conceptual mind of the student so that they kind of realize the limitations of the conceptual mind, and then all of a sudden either have some intuitive moment that is not like, it's not operating through rationality, but more of a direct experience, more of an intuition, or you could even say like gnosis. Or, similar to that, but a little different, is a nonverbal, sometimes even a nonverbal response from the teacher that, leads the student to be right here, right now, and realize, oh, this right here is absolute reality. If anything is, then this is. That's kind of the Zen approach, and it's very non-dual in that way. Even in Hermeticism, right? I'm not going to go, I don't want to make these videos super long. But if you're interested in any one of these things that I say, just leave a comment, and, I would love to make individual videos about any of this stuff. But Hermeticism, which is a tradition that is Greco-Egyptian, that, seem to have kind of bubbled out of Alexandria in the 1st and 2nd centuries after Jesus, that may have gone, definitely some of the texts and some of the ideas go farther back in history than that. But Hermeticism, deals with, it's got basically religious, some of the texts in Hermeticism are kind of more religious and cosmological and spiritual, and some of them are more about techniques and rituals and magic and alchemy and that sort of thing. But, I guess the most popular line from Hermetic literature, which is found in the Emerald Tablet, which is a text that the date of the Emerald Tablet people still definitely argue about. It may not go as far back in the past as some of the other Hermetic texts, but it's a beautiful, really, really short. It's only like a page or two. Really a beautiful text. And in the Emerald Tablet, one common translation, I think from the first line, or one of the first lines of it, is as above, so below. The law of correspondence, that sort of thing. In Hermeticism, Hermeticism has all these principles about kind of divine reality or something. And as above, so below, very non-dual. Even in the New Testament, like on earth as it is in heaven, as above, so below, highlighting that there's a correspondence. It's not two separate things. And when with as above, so below, it's very similar to things like fractals, just these self-similar patterns everywhere. And it's similar to the holographic model, that David Bohm and some others use to describe what might be going on in reality, which is, if you have a big, say you had a big hologram of my face, and then you cut a corner of that hologram, then my face actually still would be, my whole face, like the whole picture that's on the hologram, is embedded, encoded in each piece of the hologram. And so the micro is corresponding with the macro in this fractal or holographic way, as above, so below. And it's interesting with that analogy, because the little piece that's been cut off, even though it does show the whole picture, it's kind of blurry and hazy, right? Which is kind of maybe an interesting metaphor for us. Like we have we are an expression of the entire cosmos, right? So we have cosmic intelligence, cosmic creativity, cosmic, power and wisdom encoded in us, but often it appears very fuzzy, maybe. So yeah, Buddhism, Zen, as above, so below, and Hermeticism is very, very non-dual. Advaita Vedanta, as I said. Pantheism. I mean, pantheism is the idea that, the universe is God, basically, or reality itself is God, or the totality of all possible universes, the totality of all possible realities is God. Seems pretty non-dual to me. One of the most non-dual theisms out there, right? Pantheism. There is no separate God. God is reality. Reality is God. So pantheism is very non-dualistic. There's certain Gnostic gospels, certain Gnostic Christian texts have some non-dualism in them. I mean, but I guess for the most part, Gnosticism is seen as very dualistic in a lot of ways. But in the Gospel of Thomas, I feel like the Gospel of Thomas has a lot of lines that are like non-dual. The inner like the outer, the upper like the lower. The same one who made the inside made the outside. There's all this like equating two seeming polar opposites and saying no, they're the same. That in Gospel of Thomas, so that's very non-dual. And even when Jesus says, the Father isn't, I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. I think Jesus actually said several non-dual statements, and I mean, even symbolically, if we think about Jesus as the symbol for how each human being is in the Father and the Father is in them, is God, and God, like, there is no separation. The human being is God expressing itself or himself or herself or their self. And, I mean, even though the Trinity is not dualistic, but trialistic or whatever, I forgot the word for that. But in some ways, the idea of the Trinity, which of course was not explicitly stated in the Bible, but was, a doctrine that was formed, a few hundred years later, and documented as an official doctrine in the Nicene Creed, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. You could say from a more symbolic or esoteric perspective that the Trinity is a non-dual model, because it's like it's one God that's expressed in three different ways, through the Son or the human or the form, the forms down here, living things, living forms down here. That's the Son. The Father is infinity or the absolute, or being itself. And the Holy Spirit is, the basically the inner presence of God within the human being, perhaps, through intuition and energy and inherent wisdom. The lines in the New Testament about, like, basically, don't worry about what you'll say when you get into this really rough situation with somebody or a confrontation. And of course there's a lot of background to that verse that I'm not going to get into, but, like, don't worry what you're going to say, the Holy Spirit will take care of it, that sort of thing. So from one view, the Trinity is actually a really cool model that is ultimately non-dual. And then, magic and New Thought I would say are ultimately non-dual. I mean, if we think about the magician card in the tarot, right? Pointed, one hand pointed up and one down. That is a non-dual gesture, right? It's honoring the it's honoring infinity, and he's even got the infinity symbol above him. He's honoring infinity, and he's also honoring the earth and the material plane and the embodied experience. And so the magician is kind of channeling those higher forces into this plane, and they are not separate. Or perhaps the magician is fusing those so that they are not separate anymore. And obviously that as above so below is seen in that magician card as well. And so, I mean, magic and new thought, right? New thought being the distinctly American tradition that manifested in the 1800s. People that were kind of trying to come up with a spiritual and scientific or pseudoscientific exploration of the power of the mind and the power of beliefs and the power of the imagination to completely transform our lives and bring into our lives what we desire. That sort of thing. That's kind of the New Thought movement. And so magic and New Thought, in a lot of ways, are claiming that, and obviously, I mean, the history of magic and magical practices is like just such a massive one because it pervades all traditions in some way. And, I need to do a whole video about that. And I guess I have done, not about the history of magic, but about my own view of certain styles of magic. I have made a video about that. But anyways, I would say fundamentally, people who practice magic and practice New Thought techniques are basically, through their actions, claiming that their own consciousness and even their own minds is not separate from the divine mind, from God's mind, however you want to think about it. Our own consciousness is not separate from absolute consciousness. And there's a lot to say about that, but I just wanted to, on the topic of non-dualism, I would say that magic practitioners and New Thought practitioners are non-dualistic because there's no separation between the individual and the divine. And then the last tradition I just wanted to touch on, and like I said, these are just all the traditions that I am most drawn to at this point in my life in terms of spirituality and philosophy, mainly spirituality, but some philosophy in there for sure. Those are the ones that I'm discussing in my book as well, and they've really provided a lot of seeds and a lot of fuel for me to just have endless reflection and endless research. But the last tradition I want to talk about is Unitarian Universalism, and I should do a whole video about for sure. Very interesting tradition. But just to give you a little brief, just to briefly connect it to non-dualism. So there's 7 principles in UU. They're thinking about adding an eighth one sometime, maybe this year or next year. But right now it's 7, and it has been 7 since, I think, the 1980s or 1990s. But Unitarian Universalism is obviously Unitarianism and Universalism, which were actually 2 separate traditions, coming together, non-dual. They both started as basically Christian denominations that were kind of part of the Reformation. But now, they came together in 1961. They both, they interacted throughout history for the last few centuries. And they were, they had a lot in common. They always, Unitarianism was kind of more people that were maybe, I don't know, had more privilege and were a little higher class, seemed to, for the most part, be more linked to Unitarianism, I guess, especially in America, in the U.S. in the 1800s and stuff. And then Universalism was more connected with like working class folks and that sort of thing. But for the most part, the earliest seeds of these is Unitarianism was kind of rejecting the Trinity, actually. And so instead of Trinitarianism, it's Unitarianism. And they were basically saying that God is one, Let's just to be really simple about it. God is one, non-dualism. And the seventh principle in UU is having respect for the interdependent web of which we are a part. And to me, that's the modern iteration of God is one, is that there's an interdependent whole of which we are a part. And that interdependent whole, that is non-dualism. Nothing is separate. Universalism, just to be very simple about it, is kind of started as this movement that was like, wait, basically God is too good to damn anyone, essentially, and is too good to damn non-Christians, for example, that sort of thing. And so Thomas Starr King, he was a minister in the mid to late 19th century, and he was actually a Unitarian and Universalist, which is kind of crazy. But he has a famous quote about and this is not verbatim, but this is basically what he said. Unitarians believe that humans are too good to be damned by God, and Universalists believe that God is too good to damn any human. So the first principle is the modern iteration of Universalism, I would say, and the first principle in UU is the worth and dignity of each person. So separating people, dividing people, separating people, a me versus you mentality is confronted in UU, and it's this notion that's seen in other traditions of everybody is equally divine or worthy of God's love, or however you want to see it. The inherent worth and dignity of each person. So seeing everybody as equally worthy and dignified. So the whole interdependent web thing is an expression of non-dualism in UU, as well as if anything is holy, if any body is worthy, then everybody is. So there's those divisions that separate us are overcome in that teaching, and that's very non-dual. And it reminds me of that, the Buddhist version of the Golden Rule, which is what you do to others, you're doing to yourself. It's a very non-dual. It's a very non-dual teaching as well. So hopefully that gave you some food for thought. There's food for thought. There's so much more I could say about this, but that's a brief rundown. I'm sure I'll talk about it more. Take care of yourselves. Peace.